So last time we ended by beginning a discussion on variation, and there was an image at the bottom of your first page of your notes that I want us to look back at. This turns out to be a really important image describing variation because of the details that it includes. Here what we see is actually a phylogenetic tree of finches, and most of you probably remember that finches were really important to Charles Darwin and his studies during his time in the Galapagos Islands. Here you have what's known as a common ancestor that we believe to have come from South America. And from that common ancestor, we have several other species of finches that are all described using their common names and also their scientific names. So now, in the present time, we were able to connect this common ancestor that came from the mainland South America to these island birds, the islands of the Pacific, the Galapagos, that had all these different traits, or this variation between them, that actually allowed them to eat different fruits or different organisms that were available to them. And this is just kind of important to keep in mind as we move in to talk about some theories that are very important to the idea of natural selection and eventually evolution. So on our notes for today, we're discussing some theories. And these are theories for changes in species over time. How did species change over time? When you think about changes in species, there's different ways in which this can occur. These changes can be described as the diversity between those organisms within that species, or even potentially extinctions that occur within a group of organisms. One scientist that we have to mention first before we even get to Darwin is going to be Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck was the scientist that came up with the idea of inheriting acquired characteristics. What does this mean when we say acquired characteristics? This is something that you gain within your lifetime and is technically not genetic. So the idea, what was this theory that Baptiste came up with? And this picture of the giraffe is important here. So in this idea, or in this theory, he basically said that change, delta, in adults is passed onto the offspring. Changes that occur in the adult within its lifetime is passed on to the offspring. An example that was used was a giraffe stretching its neck. So you had some short-necked or shorter-necked giraffes, and one giraffe that was able to stretch its neck longer was able to use that trait and therefore passed it on. If you did not use the trait, then it was not passed on, such as this one was not stretching its neck. Obviously, we realize this later on that this is not true. However, Lamarck's idea was taken into consideration for quite a long time, and another name for his theory of inheriting acquired traits is the use versus disuse theory. Again, basically just saying the more a trait is used, the more it is passed on. However, in disuse, or the disuse of a trait, is going to lead to the loss of the trait. Another way you can think of this is working out. Okay? If you exercise a lot and really grow your biceps, that is something that you are acquiring, large biceps throughout your lifetime. However, when you go and have offspring or have children, well, they're not going to be born with the same large biceps. It just doesn't work that way. So, we did have to have someone actually prove or disprove Lamarck's idea. You do need to know Lamarck's name, so just keep that in mind for later. But evidence against Lamarck was proven or given by someone named Weissman. Weissman proved its inaccuracy. He did this in an experiment where he cut off tails of mice. Okay, not a really nice thing to do, but that's what he did. And in his experiment, after he cut off the tails of the mice, well, the babies were still born with a tail. So it showed that even though they acquired no tails during their lifetime, this was not something that was passed on to their offspring. The offspring still had tails, despite the adults not having tails. So just something to keep in mind there. This is the evidence that we have against Lamarck, and obviously later on we would gain more and more evidence. But moving on, the last thing that we're going to mention today and mention with these theories is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was known specifically for being a naturalist. And basically what naturalists like to do is they like to observe nature and ask what was happening and why was it happening. And so this was actually really important to Charles Darwin's discoveries. When he traveled the HMS Beagle, a ship from the royal family, he traveled all the way to the Pacific Ocean to the Galapagos Islands. And it turns out the fact that he reached these islands instead of a main continent was really important to his discoveries. One of the reasons why it was so important is because that the environments that he came into contact with were extremely varied. And because of these extremely varied environments, he actually learned or determined that species were very unstable. Okay, they did not stay the same. And this was due to their environment. So when we looked at their environment, what did he actually see? The variation in the environment led to differences in survival. The differences in survival were due to limiting factors. A lot of times that's going to be light, space, water, and of course mainly food in this case. The limiting factors therefore were able to choose, in this case, the environment, because of the food in the environment, was able to choose the survivors. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking of natural selection. Who is being selected for? How are they being selected for? In this image at the very bottom here, you can see that right here we have their common ancestor. And from this common ancestor, due to their environments, we have many different types of finches. Finches that were fruit eaters, insect eaters, cactus eaters, and even seed eaters. And depending on which island they lived on, they gained or acquired some traits that allowed them to eat specific things. And this is the trait that was passed on. So when we talk about the role of inheritance, you need to keep in mind that evolution is always going to start with a specific gene pool That just means we're going to be able to usually, hopefully, track where this started. What was that common ancestor? Where did our mutations or differences begin? And of course, this gene pool is going to be affected by their environment. The environment may actually allow for some to survive better than others, to be more fit. Examples, just based off of the picture, is going to be your beak size versus your food. And that leads to survival. We'll talk more specifically about Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection and actually the different players or processes that are important to natural selection next time. But for today, just take a few minutes to look back over how the idea of acquired traits was disproven, and then a little bit about how Charles Darwin discovered these differences within the finches and how they determined that the environment has a key role in natural selection. Make sure you finish the rest of your lecture and your note card as well.